Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, David, for this very kind introduction. So I talk today about slavery in ancient Greece. It's not a topic which is really familiar to me, but of course, when you are an ancient historian, you cannot neglect the question of slavery as such. And I thought this comparative economics symposium was a wonderful opportunity to address the issue of slavery. There is actually a very large body of scholarship on ancient slavery. Ancient Greek and Roman slavery has always been the object of a special interest. There's no surprise with that. The existence of slavery in a culture just like ours, at least for Greece, seems to have been based on personal freedom and even on democracy. Seems to be a contradiction in terms. Why did they have slavery, and why don't we have slaves still today? This is why the debate has focused so long on the question of this strange couple of slavery going hand in hand with freedom for the citizen. I mean, the debate about slavery in the ancient world. Another important topic has been the question of the role of Christianity or the supposed termination of slavery at the end of antiquity. A question which is now probably much more complicated than either to envisage. I mean, it's not because Christianity comes that slavery disappears. We know it's not the case. However, well, there is a link in some way. So this paper would like to propose another approach. Those who have attended our workshops and symposiums since the beginning of last year know what the orientation of our works has been. Perhaps should I re-explain it in a few words in order to better justify the topic of today. Last year, as was recently just a minute ago explained by David, our topic was the boundaries of the firm, and our various papers aimed at examining the possibility to apply the so-called theory of the firm to business organization, both of contemporary and non-contemporary societies. Was it possible to use the theory of transaction costs to examine how business partnership was built? To what extent, for instance, can a certain level of uncertainty help us to predict a certain type of business organization? Can the definition of property or the general level of trust between partners help us to make sense of a certain type of contract and business organization? Can we say that there exists an alternative between business organizations characterized by a strict hierarchical organization and organization characterized by systematic externalization of the task? Last year's papers soon proved that in every case there exists a specific mix of internalization and externalization, but always this mix was directly linked to the level of uncertainty. The environmental and comparative approach thus proved to be extremely fruitful. It is this type of investigation I would like to develop before you today for the case of bound labor and slavery in ancient Greece. Instead of starting from slavery and considering it an objective fact and circumscribed datum you could only have to investigate, the goal of this paper is exactly the opposite. I consider ancient slavery to be a specific construct, the existence of which is not self-evident. How can we make sense of slavery? If we, fortunately, can do without slavery, how is it that people in antiquity apparently would not? To begin with, would it be that our set of values and theirs, I mean the people of antiquity, was not the same? Obviously, there is a difference. Indeed, it seems now pretty common to make fun of the Christian or liberal feelings, mocking the supposed hypocrisy of those who fought for the abolition of slavery, for instance, in the 19th century. But the very expression of these feelings should challenge us. Addressing the question of values, of human values, seems to be an odd approach of the question previously raised, slavery. This is, however, a question that cannot be left aside, and for at least two reasons. The most obvious one is not to be accused of articulating a defense of slavery. Indeed, the case has been made recently against our own Robert Vogel and Stanley Engelman, whose famous Time on the Cross. In the Time of the Cross, both Vogel and Engelman showed that, in fact, slavery in the American South was profitable. And this has recently been read as a defense of slavery, but by Paul Bissoni. But again, our own Bill Sewell cannot be here today, as providing a very clear answer to the question, so I don't need to come back to it. But the main reason that remains for all of us is to understand how people seemingly like us could tolerate the horrors of slavery. The point could be made also for the American South. But let's stay in the ancient world. Aristotle could famously in the Politics build a complex argument pretending that slavery could exist by nature per se, and that it was inherent to the nature of inferior races, the barbarians, to be enslaved. Or simply by the fact, if you fall in the hands of, to the hands of a conqueror, well, inevitably, it is his right to enslave you. Apparently, this did not convince everyone, even by the time of Aristotle. Others, however, maintained that, etc. So that slavery is contrary to nature. So the point was not, was debated, the very existence of slavery was debated as early as the classical period. And later, much later, at the end of antiquity, we find this. So in the Digest, in Florentius, well, slavery was simply considered to be contrary to nature, contra naturam. So there was a debate in antiquity, anyway, on the right to enslave human beings. The horror of the condition of the slaves cannot be doubted. One of the most grueling descriptions of manhunt in the ancient world is provided by Xenophon's Agesilaus. This is just a 19th century, a very famous representation of slave market, the horror. There is much eroticism in this representation anyway, but maybe it was not that different as it was imagined by Boulanger a little more than 1 century ago. Anyway, one of the most grueling descriptions of slavery you might find is in Xenophon's Agesilaus. Agesilaus was the famous general, a king of Sparta. He campaigned in Asia Minor, in Western Asia Minor, in the early 4th century BCE. He's very famous because he was a friend of Xenophon, and Xenophon wrote a whole treatise on the life of his friend Agesilaus. So this Agesilaus, for instance, is praised by Xenophon for being a very generous person. For instance, when there was an opportunity to make plunder, he made sure that his friends were the first to get access to the plunder. As you see, he was very, very generous. But what was it about when Agesilaus mentioned plunder? The beginning of the next paragraph probably gives us a clue, and this we'll read in more detail. So, when shipped in Kent, they noticed little children, the merchants, left behind. Well, many merchants offered children for sale because they thought they would not be able to carry and feed them. He looked after them too and had them conveyed to some place of refuge. Again, he arranged that prisoners of war were too old to accompany the army, were to be looked after that they may not fall a prey to dogs and wolves. So he was very generous because he took care of the old people, of the kids which were left behind. Left behind what? The big razzias. The armies captured, enslaved, preferably probably the parents or the adults, and left behind the kids. Sometimes the merchants might also enslave the kids. The kids, sometimes not. So that you had crowds of kids left behind that were bound to die, falling or being the prey of dogs and wolves. But I guess Alain was very generous. Maybe he was not that generous. Maybe he was also hoping to make money out of that. But in any case, this shows very well what actually the razzias for slaves were, and the horror of slavery and manhunt in antiquity. Of course, war was not the only source of slaves in the ancient world. Many young children were sold by the people of their own tribe, if not of their own family. In his Acharnians, Aristophanes presents the desperate situation of the city of Megara, badly stricken by the consequences of the war against Athens. So Athens had banned Megarians to access its ports. And anyway, during the war, the famous Peloponnesian War, the Megarians could not sell, as they used to do, their products on the Athenian market. So what happened? Of course, the Megarians were starving. So much so that Aristophanes' fictional Megarian comes to Athens to sell his own daughters as prostitutes. So, hail, market of Athens, beloved of Megarians, let Zeus, the patron of friendship, witness, I regret you as a mother molds her son. Come, poor little daughters of an unfortunate father, try to find something to eat. Listen to me with the full heed of an empty belly. Which would you prefer? To be sold or to cry with hunger? And the daughters, to be sold, to be sold. Well, to die from hunger or be sold into slavery and become a prostitute, there was no alternative. This desperate situation of parents unable to feed their children still finds an echo in the early modern period with the tale of Hoppo, my son, of Charles Perrault, Petit Pousset in French. From ancient Mesopotamia, we actually have to sell contracts of children. The parents sell their children the imprints of the feet of their children sold into slavery, the imprint in clay of the feet of the children sold into slavery. So this shows enough that if the situation of Megara is supposed to be unusual in the ancient Greek world, in the ancient world as a whole, in general, it was far from exceptional. So, war, hunger, famine, etc. But the third source of slaves was, of course, the natural reproduction from mothers who were themselves slaves. The fathers would be fellow slaves, or very frequently the masters of the households. There was a fourth source of slaves to which I will come a little later. Nobody seems to have doubted that in every way slavery was the worst possible fate for a man. You read Odyssey and you see that very clearly. In ancient Greece, slaves were not confined to a separate world far from the sight of the common citizens. They were literally everywhere. When in comparison with the American South, maybe you could live in a town and not see what happened in a plantation in the American South. But literally in Greece, the slaves were everywhere. In the fields, the mines, the workshops, also in the houses. And again comes the question of how could free people endure the sight of slavery and, for the rest, wage a normal life? Of course, if one dare say, for the masters, it's all a matter of education, of habit, of training to admit that the situation that prevailed to their own benefit was a product of natural conditions, given the natural inferiority of slaves. But it was also a situation that the gods had approved, and maybe also a situation that the slaves themselves highly appreciated. I found pages of supporters of slavery in the American South, absolutely beautiful, about the slaves who were very happy with their condition. So, coming back to the initial point, the question of the acceptation of slavery is that, in fact, of the acceptation of daily violence. And for this is my point. If one dare say, the Greek society was extremely well prepared. War was not an exceptional situation which would have happened 2 or 3 times per century. It was nearly permanent in the ancient Greek world. Athens was famously at war 2 years out of 3 during the 5th and 4th century. Killing or being killed was the lot of ordinary citizens. The stelae bearing the casualty list of citizens who lost their lives every year on various battlefields provides the most striking illustration of this situation. The Greeks were used to erect stelae. In Athens, there is an extraordinary collection of stelae where you see hundreds and hundreds of names of the young guys who died every year on the various battlefields. I can show you something which is maybe less familiar. It's another city, Thespis, which is a city in Boeotia, and for one battle in 424 BC, we have a monument with 25 stelae showing that there were approximately, probably over 300 dead young men for one battle for a small city. So really, dying in the battlefield was very frequent for a young Athenian, for a young Spartan, but also for a young Thespian, for a young Boeotian, etc., in every city. Anyway, a boy learned by heart his Homer, and he found there every possible model of violence, and he was trained, he trained his mind to carnage, destruction, and enslavement of vanquished populations. This form of violence is linked to another one, the violence that could be exercised not only by the masters on free populations, but by free people on other free people at work, but also by free people on other free people at the very core of the system, within the family. I'm not referring especially to the beating of young children at school or at home, which was common. No, I'm referring to the violence exercised by their fathers on their own children. And the question needs to be examined in more details. The many deaths on the battlefield of so many young men under acceptation were part of a demographic structure. This demographic structure was very different from what we are used to. It was based on a very early marriage for girls around the age of 15. These early marriages, combined with hygienic conditions that were, on the whole, on the good side for pre-modern societies, produced the conditions of a demographic boom. This helps us to make sense both of the number of untimely deaths on the battlefield for young men and of the frequency of child exposure in the ancient world, especially for girls. So this is the basic condition for the basic demographic model. Ancient populations, especially in the Greek world, had long been supposed to have the greatest difficulties to maintain their level of reproduction, fighting to reach a growth of 1 or 2 per thousand per year. Everything points now to the opposite. The demographic model of ancient Greece was based on a potential growth that was probably around, if not above 10 per thousand per year. It means a population could be multiplied by a factor of 2.7 in 1 century. Overpopulation was checked by a combination of many deaths on the battlefield for young free men and prevalence of exposure for baby girls. Ideally, there would be a balance between genders at the age of marriage, and probably in fact there was a strong imbalance between gender for young adults. These demographic mores were transmitted to the Greeks overseas, for instance, to Egypt. This is a letter, it's a very precious document, it's a letter from a husband to his wife. The husband has moved to Alexandria from the Fayum, so the oasis west of the Nile, and he's writing to his beloved Alice, his sister. In fact, it's a common term of affection to say his wife. So do not worry if when all the others return, I remain in Alexandria. I beg and beseech of you to take care of the little child, and as soon as we receive wages, we will send them to you. If, good luck to you, you bear offspring, if it's a male, let it live. If it's a female, expose it. You told Aphrodite, do not forget me. How can I forget you? I beg you never not to worry, etc. So this is very characteristic. This private document, a private letter, and you see that, of course, for a baby girl, you must expose it, no difficulty at that. So there's a huge discussion about exposure in antiquity. And for instance, Clarice and Thompson, when they published their extraordinary book on counting the people in Egypt in the Fayum, when they have houses of Egyptian and Greeks living side by side, when you have an Egyptian family, it's a balance of gender, 50-50, boys and girls. When you have a Greek family, the girls have disappeared. There's strong unbalance between boys and girls. It's typical of the Greek, more or less, the Greek habit of the girls. Same situation for the Cretans of Miletus, as described by Brile in 1990. And it's exactly what Polybius says. So it's part of a demographic structure. And when I talk about values, I think values are abstract values. It's how you behave with your own it's environment, human environment. So in Greece, for instance, I believe that the sacrifice of Iphigenia by her own father Agamemnon echoes the exposures of multitudes of baby girls in ordinary Greek families. What was the fate of these babies? Most of them certainly died. Some of them, however, could be rescued by persons who could raise them as slaves. Girls could become prostitutes or workers somewhere. And this is a key feature to understand the plots of several plays of the late classical Hellenistic period, like in the Latin version by Plautus in the Cassina, Sistellaria, etc. Exposure of children is not a topos, a literary topos, it's real world, actually, that translates on the stage. How does this connect with our initial question, which was that of human values of the ancient Greek society? Obviously, the first characteristic of this society is the omnipresence of violence. The external one, but the domestic, internal one against their own children. Both wars and child exposures were causes of untimely deaths and sources of slaves. By contrast, the later Christian society promoted sexual abstinence in general, late marriage, promoted also monastic life, discouraged remarriage of widows, and so, of course, it strictly prohibited child exposure. This is not to say that slavery disappeared with Christianity. Of course not. We know, for instance, the Byzantine world there were still slaves. But in the end, at least in the West, in the Western medieval Europe, as such, it was not possible to enslave another human being. I think it is part of also the ideology, the global ideas are part of a demographic structure. Christianity is not only ideas, the presence of the soul, it's also a complete transformation of the attitude toward human flesh, actually, and towards it was also a demographic structure. When later slavery was developed again in the Christian world, it was ethnically based and established on the supposed non-fully human character of the people who were enslaved. In the US in the 19th century, acknowledging the human character of the slaves meant per se undermining the slave ideology. So far, I have deliberately concentrated on the ideological context, although with the demographic background, kinship background. I formed the background of the ancient Greek slavery and insisted on the violent relationship that prevailed in every sector of the life of the Greek cities. I should, of course, add that slavery was not a creation of the late archaic classical period. As we know very well, already the Mycenaean tablets revealed the existence of slaves, doero, the existence of the later Greek doulos. And so far as the social and economic structures of the Mycenaean world were obviously significantly different from those of the Iron Age and of the classical period, it's not easy to make a comparison between the slave system of the second millennium and that of the first millennium. I'll come back to that maybe in the discussion. Anyway, it remains certain that the Doero of the Mycenaean world was a worker belonging to a master, just like the Homeric Demos. If the slave system existed already in the second and early first millennium, and if, as we saw, violence was everywhere in ancient Greece and formed the best terrain for the development of slavery, shouldn't we accept the view that the slave system, the late archaic classical and Hellenistic periods, is best explained by the concept of path dependence? There was slavery before. Let's go on. And shouldn't we even stop there and be satisfied with this observation? The answer should be no, for we would miss the specific forms of slavery in the classical Greek world. No less in a sort of contrafactual attempt, we could imagine that with the development of the market system in the classical period, wage labor might have replaced slavery. But as we know, this is not what happened. In ancient Greece, the prevalent form of slavery until the end of the archaic period was certainly the exploitation of dependent peasant communities who tilled the land for their masters. This was the case with the Cretan Noitai, with the famous Spartan Helots, the Thessalian Penestai, certainly Macedonian Laoi, etc. The list would be much longer. These dependent peasants were both in and out of the civic community, out because they were exploited and had no political power, in because they were nevertheless members of the wider community. For instance, famously, the Helots were Lacedaemonians, the Penestai were Thessalians, and so much so that in the Hellenistic period, what happened, for instance, in Thessaly, these Penestai were integrated into the citizen body. It is now very clearly proved by recent articles on the cities of Pharsalos. So this is not a trivial question. If Thessalian Penestai could become full citizens, couldn't we imagine that in other cities, slaves might gradually have been granted freedom, and why not citizenship, then working as salaried workers, just like they would do today? The thesis I would like to develop now will be twofold. First, despite the fact that indeed the late archaic classical Hellenistic slave system is a form of continuation of the pre-existing form of slavery, its new configuration was an original creation. Second, this new creation played a crucial role in the exceptional process of growth of Greece in this period. You made out that there was a growth in ancient Greece. I tried to prove you that there was a process of growth. This represents the shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, so mainly Greek and later Roman wrecks, and you see in the unified world in the second, third century BC, and you observe the extreme process of growth, and also later in the later imperial period, negative growth. You may have see this also in the most recent article by Wilson in 2014. Much debate about that, especially for the Roman period. But in any case, the global increase and decrease, I think no one will seriously challenge. So there was a process of growth, and this process of growth is basically linked to slavery. So this form of slavery of the late archaic period onwards finds no precedent in the previous period as such, as a model of organization. There were slaves before, but this type of organization is really new. The slaves in these new cities of the classical period, let's say, were everywhere. I said that already. They could be prostitutes, females and males. They could be school teachers. They could be cooks, doctors, accountants, managers, bankers, musicians, policemen, more original, even in some cases, merchants traveling on the seas. The list of professions is almost unlimited. The point we should never forget that is almost in every case, although admittedly in various proportions, the same jobs could be, and indeed were, performed by free people. Some of the same, for instance, workshop, or in the same, for instance, when you build a temple, you had side by side free workers and slaves. And in fact, the situation, when I say slave situation, is more complex, depending on the actual form of exploitation of the slave. The slave could be under the direct control of the foreman, whoever he was. Maybe the foreman was also a slave. But the slave could also benefit of a kind of independence. He or she could thus be in charge of the shop, of a workshop, and simply pay a rent to her or his master. So there were various forms of exploitation of labor. So the slaves were everywhere. Second inescapable fact is that slavery was a mass phenomenon. I cannot provide you figures, there is a huge debate. You don't find two specialists who agree on the figures, but believe me, it was a mass phenomenon. At least everyone agrees on that. Let's say that in Athens, maybe there were 40, 50% of the whole population who were slaves. It was an exceptional city in this respect, but it could go up to that level. And so the question we have now is how to make sense of this economic side of the exploitation of the slave labor. When I began working on this topic, I must say I was, I don't know, I should say happy or unhappy to find that very little had been written on the question. Well, if you don't believe me, read the article, it's online. Kirtatas, in the recent Bradley Cartledge big book on it's the world history of slavery. So very recent work. The exact title is The Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 1. So slavery in economy, but it's very descriptive, tells you that there are slaves in agriculture, in workshops, etc., but beyond that, nothing serious. So if you want to read more, you find more in, for instance, people who are scholars who have worked on specific issues like agriculture or mining, for instance, in Flamand recent book on the manayage en argent d'Athènes, and then you will find analysis of the role of slaves in these sectors of activity. And even I was very disappointed, I must say, reading the Marxist scholars, Western Marxist scholars, and they devote very little attention to production. I might come back to that if our question and why this happens. In fact, the most productive site was probably the old Soviet historiography that was much more interesting than the Western Marxist approach. So I believe that only an economic analysis can allow us to make sense of slavery and its huge development in the ancient Greek world. The real question is just to examine the intervention of slaves in production operation, both at macro and microeconomic levels. You'll allow me to start with a comparative approach. That's what we are here for. And I will start with this famous, one of these famous photos of the California gold rush of 1849 around. It could be Yukon gold rush, Australia gold rush at the end of the 19th century. Thousands of poor people from the whole planet rushed to become miners. And this could even be still true today. I will use the photo of Sebastian Salgado, an extraordinary photographer, Brazilian photographer. And for instance, this is a mine. It is the mine of Serra Pelada in Brazil. What you see, the little dots, it's men actually who are climbing the huge cliffs with a bag full of earth. And they hope that there is a nugget, a gold nugget so that's another view. And you see the ladders and you climb. And this is seen from the top. If you fall, you're dead. So these are not slaves. They are free people. How is it that if this is possible today, this is the 1980s, it could still be, the photos could probably still be taken today. Why was it that in antiquity, people resorted to slaves. Why? Because after all, if we were in the Lorient, this is the southern district of Athens, the big industrial, if you have the opportunity to visit the district of Thorikos, Lavrion, don't hesitate, you observe what is actually industrial activity in antiquity. Everything is still visible on the surface. So huge, you see washeries everywhere, you see big cisterns for the water, to wash the ore. Sector of Thorikos, you see the entrance of the mine, and the very deep mines, more than 100 deep, in the shafts, and the slaves that work down there. And this is not Athens, it's Corinth, the 6th century, but it shows you slaves, let's admit it, slaves working in such a mine, and more or less they look like our people, the people we saw in Brazil in the mine of Serra Pelada. So, how can we explain that? Why resorting to slaves? And why not using the market of free workers? Well, let's first observe the conditions of work are not the same. Whether in California in 1849 or in today's Brazil, gold rush miners worked each for himself, hoping to find the nugget that will make him rich in 1 second. The work conditions in the Lorient were quite different. It was a true industrial process, which was supposed to extract, wash, grind, and purify thousands of tons of ore. There was no individual gain possible. So the individualistic approach couldn't work in the case of the Lorient. Let's go even further. At a macroeconomic level, if there was an advantage for the miners, I mean, for the mine owners, the mine exploiters, what was the advantage? Well, it was first being able to increase massively, in a short period of time, the workforce available in a given operation, not depending on the local market of the workforce. Let's suppose that an entrepreneur deliberately modernized the vocabulary who wants to develop quickly new activities. Today, there's capital, it will invest it massively in new machines, will hire workers on the market that is usually very large, national market, for instance, the US, Europe, China, India, so millions, hundreds of millions of workers that may want to work in this new activity. And at last, you could also hire people from beyond the borders, or if it's technically and legally possible, it can even relocate his activity in a country with lower wages. In the framework of an ancient Greek city, given the level of technology, the workforce will be the crucial factor for the new development. Not the only one, but the crucial one. Given the small dimension of the city labor market, and the social and political barriers that tended to limit the arrival of free foreigners could represent a danger to the civic community. The massive import of enslaved population provided in a short period of time the boost that allowed to provide the workforce necessary for quick development of a given sector. So forced labor is the key to make sure that in a few years you have boost your new activity. Thus, let's take the case of Lorient silver mines in Athens. Show you an owl of the late 6th century BC. These are the products precisely of the Lorient mines. We can estimate that the big boom of the Lorient began in 515 with the first owls, BC, and the mines were in full production in 480 BC. So it means that in about 35 years, with very short time span, there was a prodigious development, and that allowed the city of Athens to become the richest and most powerful city in the Greek world. And the increase in silver production from a few talents to perhaps 1,000 talents per year was based on the exploitation of the slaves in the Lorient. And this, of course, allowed Athens to become the first city in the Greek world. So slavery, massive forced arrival of people captured in the so-called barbarian territory, speeded up the process of growth. A non-trivial advantage of resulting to a slave workforce was also that there was a period that where this workforce was not anymore necessary. For instance, because in a mine, the metal veins, the seams were exhausted, it was possible to resell the slaves and quickly diminish or even terminate the activity without inevitably having to deal with social demands of workers, of free workers. You export the slaves, either not to another city which needs them. You couldn't do that with your fellow citizens. Where the modern world relies on the market and the free will of workers, the ancient world relied on the market and on the forced transfer of workers. The example of mining activity could be extended to other production sectors, like famously the new big farms, specializing in oil and wine productions. These farms allowed huge profit for their owners. They required a very large workforce. Slavery provided them the flexibility that allowed them to supply the market, progressing in fits and starts in an environment that was much more uncertain than today. At a microeconomic level, slavery provided a huge comparative advantage, and this for three main reasons. First, we know from some sources the existence of conflicts between contractors and their partners, like for instance in Paris, the island of Paris in the first half of the 2nd century BC, and observed that there was a conflict and people were back. There was a strike and conflict between employers and employees. Of course, free people in that case, and the agoranomos magistrates intervened to prevent that. But slaves who lived under the threat of the whip or torture could not seriously envisage a strike. The alternative was sabotage, revolt, but under pain of torture and death if this revolt was a failure. In this respect, slavery provided the entrepreneurs a form of mastering of uncertainty that wage labor could not. Second, the very uncertainty of the ancient market, with the unpredictable ups and downs of demand, although it was not unproblematic for the management of the slave workshop itself, avoided the inevitable scattering of a highly trained workforce. So if the demand falls, you may reallocate the slaves to another activity, for instance, or maybe you can temporarily hire them to other producers, to other farmers, or to other actors, and you keep a hold on this workforce and re-employ it as soon as there was again demand is improving. Third and not least, slavery allowed to impose the longest possible days, even in appalling conditions, in terms of arduousness of work, hygiene, or security. Many slaves working in the mines were hired by entrepreneurs to their masters. They were not supposed, these masters, to return the same slaves, but only the same number of slaves. The slaves that died. Free workers might have accepted to work in the Laurian mines, but they would have exacted salaries far higher than the cost that was necessary to feed the same slave workers. In other words, slavery allowed an over-exploitation of the workforce and allowed the entrepreneurs to make cheaper profits, say, today. The richest of all the Athenians were not landowners, very well proved now by the work of Kirsty Shipton. The richest of the Athenians were miners. I mean, not workers in the mines, but those who had invested in mines. So the profitability of slavery should not be doubted. And there inevitably one conquers with argument developed by Vogel and Engelmann, which doesn't mean at all that we should see there a justification of slavery. This doesn't mean that slavery didn't have drawbacks. The cost of maintaining property rights, as slaves frequently run away from their masters, could be very high. The first system of insurance that we know of was precisely designed to compensate slave owners if their slaves run away. Second, the cost of finding alternative production strategies when demand plummeted was certainly also very high. But unfortunately cannot be with us today, as briefly shown last year in our own comparative economic series by Cam Hawkins, manumission is a clause of paramoné, that you have to serve your master, even if you have been manumitted. Well, it was a way to mitigate the convenience of slavery, and also, of course, to the benefit of the slave owners. So, imaginative new institutional solution insists on this, and this form of creation that mass slavery was in the classical Greek period. So these imaginative new institutional solutions were devised to compensate these drawbacks, and this allowed to maintain the system as a whole. I think I should stop here because I'm exactly on my time. I'm sure that we'll have questions that will help me to say move forward in this research. Thank you.
So I would like to say Cameron Hawkins was going to be here to give a more formal response. I won't give a response. My name is David Schlone, by the way, for those who don't know me. I'm an archaeologist at the University of Chicago at the Oriental Institute here, not a specialist by any means in the Greek economy or Greek slavery. But I have one question that I'd like to start with, and then we'll throw it open for others to discuss and ask and comment as you will. I'll just put a question to Alain. First of all, thanking him for a very stimulating presentation, which provoked some new thoughts, for me at least, about the, shall we say, rather crassly, the overall profitability or optimality of slavery as an economic mode in the spirit of Robert Fogel. I think it's a very interesting thing to think about. And then you touched upon, in a sense, the transaction costs from the point of view of the owners or entrepreneurs, the employers, and how, in fact, slavery was quite efficient for them and low in cost. But obviously, there are other costs that are being absorbed elsewhere. So, for example, as you mentioned, the cost of policing the military costs, so to speak, the fundamental military costs, all the resources needed to maintain a slave society with control of a very, very large enslaved population. And I guess my question is, do we have any sense in the ways in which those costs are passed on or passed down, back down to these owners in a way that would in any way, are they free riders in this system? And in that case, should we also talk about the larger costs to the state of maintaining the system, and whether in the aggregate for the whole economy, this really is, an optimal solution? Like, once you consider all of the possible costs involved in maintaining a system of bound labor of this kind. So that's my question that your very interesting talk provoked, and I wonder if you could answer that, and then we'll just open it up for others to comment as they wish.
I'll try to answer this question right away. Well, thank you for the question. Actually, yes, there is a contrast between a population of slaves, which is really completely private in the case of the cities like Athens, Rome, etc. It's not, slaves are not the property of the community, they are really the property of a single owner. Private and public, the city kind of slaves also, for instance, for managing the accounts of the city, etc. But most of the slaves are, of course, private slaves. But when it comes to maintaining the costs, we're maintaining the right of property. Of course, it's a collective system. It cannot be an individual system. So, but the answer should be two sides. What does it mean? Let's imagine that I worked for some years with people on other friends and scholars working on crossing the borders in the ancient world. And the image of the ancient world, the Greek cities, was like an open world. You come to a city and you move it, just like one. It's absolutely not true. This was, let's take the case of Athens, because we know it very well, but it could be any city in the ancient world, etc. It's in a prison. the borders are very strictly protected all the time. For instance, the northern border of Athens, the rest of the sea. The northern border of Athens, you have patrols of young men patrolling the border. Why do they do this? Well, because it's maintain the security of the city against possible attacks on the neighbors, etc. But also, basically, it's because you must also prevent the runaway slaves to leave Athens. For an example, I don't remember in which, might be even in the banquet of Plato, one of the guests said, "I'm very sorry I come late, but I was in the northern border, but I was chasing one of my runaway slaves." Of course, well, the slave wanted to cross the border to go to the other side. Maybe his fate on the other side wouldn't be better, but he might be recognized as runaway slaves. Returned to Athens, or maybe appropriated by other masters on the other side. That's another story. But these were really closed world, very well protected. You don't cross the border like this for a very simple, basic reason, because a human being is valued. When you come to Athens, for instance, you're a free guy, no problem. But if you're a slave, as a human being, there's a tax on the import or export of human beings. So the state was interested as controlling the borders, because it was also its interest, and the taxes on the slaves were very high, and it was a not negligible source of income for the state. So how is it performed? Well, as you saw, for instance, an individual man was chasing his own runaway slave, but he could expect that somewhere on the border, some patrol would have stopped that guy, and that he would be able to return to slavery. There were agreements between cities to exchange their runaway slaves. And on the whole, how did the system work? Because the men of the city, the citizens, were a militia. There were an army that could be mobilized in a few hours. And for instance, in the district of the Sunium, there were fortresses. There was one in the south at Sunium, but there was other fortresses north of the mining district, well, to protect the district against possible invasions, but also as a security to make sure that the slaves would be kept there. So was the danger that the slaves might run away, or of course the threat of revolts. And we know that again, because I took the example of the Lorians, very convenient to me, there were two big revolts in the Lorian in 130 and around 12 BC. And there, it was very difficult. The Athenian army had to be mobilized to crush the revolts. The most famous revolts was Spartacus and in Italy, but there were also revolts in the Greek world. So yes, private appropriation, but also the system cannot work if the whole system does not acknowledge, of course, its base in slavery. Appropriation of man is possible by law, and of course also the police will take care of the runaway slaves. The costs, well, it's the cost of the state. The cost of the state in Greece is different than the cost of the state in the Middle East, in Oriental tradition. The way I see it, I call this a kind of low-cost state. The whole story is not of a permanent army. That permanent army is very expensive, and also it's a kind of danger for the freedom of the citizens. So it's the mobilization of the militias that take care of that. Well, I think parallels with the American South could be made. And if you saw a slave walking in the street who was not allowed to, then you could probably, even if it was not your slave, you could ask him, "What are you doing here?" And it was a kind of collective control on the slaves.
So other comments? Go right ahead, yes.
So just analogies between this and the South, except for the thing that is distinctive about the South, which is the racial ideology side of it. Or I'm just curious if that is in fact something distinct, or is it in fact that the reason they didn't include conquered populations as free migrants and instead as slaves had sort of something like an ideological justification that looked like something like superiority, or how did they manage that difference, I guess, is the...
I wish I tell the beginning of the politics is fascinating. The whole beginning of the politics is about slavery. The oikos, but in the oikos, the free people and the slaves. So the whole beginning of the politics is about slavery. It's not something that should be neglected. So yes, the question is that when you have barbarians, it's okay. Barbarians are inferior. There are the Greeks at the top and the barbarians below. So the kind of racial ideology is not absent. But the problem with this guy, so to say that when you have the racial difference, which is, for instance, appearing, the color of the skin, etc., that's very easy to make a difference in supposing tolerance, etc. When you have people who are cannot be distinguished racially after one generation, can be distinguished from Kai and from the Greek, there actually no difference. So it's very, very difficult to do that. There were debates. And also, the question is also because you could have people who were Greeks who were enslaved by what? You are a free person. Plato himself was a slave for a few months. Enslaved. So everything is possible because it happens that, and then it happens to you. And if you have friends, a rich family, they will rebuy you. Otherwise, you will continue your miserable life as a slave. So Aristotle is very careful to make this distinction. It's racially based, because if you are a barbarian, yes, you're an inferior person, but also if you are weak enough to have been enslaved or lost a battle, well, you deserve to be enslaved in some way. That's the point. It's very ambiguous. It is not something we have in the American South.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alain. So I guess I wanted to raise sort of 3 quick points. One has to do with the paradox you point to, or the supposed paradox between the existence of ideologies of liberty and democracy on the one hand and slavery on the other. I want to say a word about this sort of value system to which you pointed, and then I want to ask a question about that I take it that at some level the ongoing existence of slavery remains something like a significant explanandum, and I'll come back to that. So first, about the 3 points will end up, I hope, being tied together. About liberty and slavery, I take it that we would agree that, in part as the result of the radical restriction of full citizen rights to tiny portions of the population, then when we talk about ideologies of liberty, or when we talk about ancient democracy, we're always talking about essentially what we would, at a purely numerical level, call an oligarchy. That is, pre-modern democracies were in fact democracies over someone. And that pre-modern democracies persist by sustaining particular forms of domination of very restricted groups of the population, 10, 15%, who have full rights over very large, then say 85% of the population, who are to varying degrees disenfranchised or dominated. And in that sense, the ideology of liberty, or the ideology of democracy, or the institutionalization of democracy has to be contextualized in light of, in fact, a large number of systems of domination, of which slavery is one. And then perhaps in that broader context, the paradox has to find a different meaning. So that'd be one. About the value system, and this is something of a digression, but it was the order in which I thought of it. But you did talk about the taxation of movement of humans, and I would simply point out a fact that you know, in fact, better than I, which is that in a number of the tax regulations that govern the movement of living things around the countryside and across city borders, living things were often broken down in classification between, as you know, tetrapodon and anthropodon, right? That is, four-footed animals and human-footed animals. So quite apart from the notion that, quite apart from the occasional philosophical concern that these slaves are humans and therefore somehow like us, there existed a very broad set of discursive and regulatory structures and a set of languages according to which it was actually fairly easy to classify these people as simply a different form of cattle, right? And that emerges in these documents that have to do with the movements across borders, which I thought of. But then I guess about your sort of, about both the Megarian enslaving his daughters or selling them into a form of slavery that involves presumably prostitution, and your comparison between ancient and modern gold mining. I guess, and I was also pleased that David raised the subject of Cam Hawkins' work on Roman manumitted slaves, because it's just not entirely clear to me, given the absence of any broad system of social welfare and the quite radical risks borne by the poor, it's not clear to me why they couldn't have, as it were, instrumentalized the terrifyingly, instrumentalized the terrifying weakness of the poor in these societies and the marginal status of the poor to produce something like institutionalized forms of social dependency that would have allowed employers far greater flexibility than slavery, to return to your sort of language about why did they use slaves. I mean, in Rome, right, the manumitted slaves remained subject to legally enforceable obligations to provide labor to their employers, and it's not at all clear why you needed, as it were, an intervening status of slavery when various forms of punishment in respected indebtedness and so on could not have produced a similar form of domination without bothering to enslave them and free them at Rome, or frankly in Athens. I take it that one thing one would have to say is that the capture of people in war remains absolutely fundamental to this system, because otherwise you could easily force your. It's hard to see how you couldn't come up with a mechanism, and they did come up with mechanisms just to exploit to a quite radical degree their neighbors. So that's one, and the other is that therefore is there something then to return to the problem of citizens and, as it were, the social ownership of the system of slavery? Is there something about the form of ancient democracy which requires slavery as its other to sustain it, right? That the ideology of the freedom and equality of the few is codependent with the ideology of the dependence, both the ideology and the institutionalized subjugation of some others.
So the question of link between this freedom and slavery, I think that yes, that's my whole point. To be we imagine Greece where it's democracy, equality, etc. But the reality is very different. So this was if I at God's will, I write a book that will, the title of which will be These Wild Greeks. They are very different from what we are. So we should not project our view of freedom democracy on the past. And exactly in Athens, probably about half of the population was free. That's immense. That's something fundamental. But what I try to show is that it was this real construction, because in the others, let's take the case of Sparta. I mentioned the case of the Thessaly, very, very important region, but Thessaly had its own way, its own evolution. Sparta more or less the same. The big question in Sparta in the Hellenistic period, will we integrate these workers into the citizen body? And the revolutionary kings, Agis, Cleomenes, exactly this is their goal. to make sure that we have a large citizen body in Sparta. It became so exclusive that there were about 800 people, ridiculously small group, and what they want to rebuild a large city, and you have these workers, these peasants, they might become citizens, so in that case, this is why I said the other way, the Athenian way, market, slavery, etc. This was not the only possible way. The other way, the traditional way, coming from the second millennium, the Doeroi of the second millennium, the Laoi, the Penastai of the first millennium, it leads to a type of society which is very different. In some way, you can't. There is no fate for Greek society to end with this mass system of slavery. It's a specific development which is linked to the market, which is linked to the development of the market system. And beyond the case of democracy, so the whole question is the development of the market that fuels, in this very specific form of society, the development of slavery. Your point about, yes, yes, but that was fundamental, but this was also a construct. I mean, again, if you read Aristotle, the fact that it was really not, it was cataphysic to enslave people, this was something that was in discussion in this world. This was not out of their reach. I mean, it was not something that was debated. It was not something that they could not conceive. Of course, we could discuss that. Maybe not with the right solution, but we could discuss that.
But it is important to note, just for the non-ancient historians, that despite an ongoing philosophical discussion about this, it is, I think, true that we know of this philosophical conversation never generated in the entire history of antiquity anywhere that we know of an abolitionist movement. Nobody actually proposed getting rid of slaves, ever, right?
No, that in their world, but it doesn't mean that it was not possible to conceive that slavery was against nature. It's very clear. Even in the classical period, this discussion is ongoing discussion. Also, a point I would like to make on the welfare of the poor. Well, this was the system that was devised in Athens, with the system of the Diobelia. You give to every citizen 2 obols, which is not much, but it's a kind of allowance to make sure that you won't die, won't starve, just like the poor Megarians. So this developed, provided you have a slave working in the mines, of course. You give to this. The whole project of the poroi, the treaties of the poroi of Xenophon, again, this Xenophon, Xenophon of Hesiodus, there's a big financial crisis. It's not only in modern times that there were a financial crisis, financial, political crisis in 354, 353 BC. It's a big catastrophe in Athens. Everything is trying to find any form of income. It's a big monetary reform, and so we won't talk about that. It's absolutely fundamental in this thing. And Xenophon comes with a proposal. He has written a little treatise. He said, well, if we bought slaves, the city bought itself slaves that would be hired to miners, to entrepreneurs, then every Athenian citizen would be able to receive 3 obols per day. So the only way to feed the system of allowance for every citizen is to exploit the slaves. Of course, that's the answer the question, but yeah.
I'm going to come back to this question a little bit on what you said. I think you said at some point that the slavery gave the owner control over certainty. I can see arguments going the other way. One aspect to me of slavery is that part of risks are assumed by the owner. risk that you identified of the fluctuation in the demand for the labor services. If I hire a worker and I don't want to work for him anymore, I just fire him. If I'm a slave, I can't fire him, I have to free him. So I'm assuming that the risk so he said there's a big surge in demand for labor. The owner can just go and buy lots of slaves and bring them in, and then when he doesn't need them anymore, he can sell them. But there again, he's taking on a lot of risk because he's buying when price is high and he's selling them when prices are low. So he's going to take a big hit. He's going to feel the risk through the capital loss that he takes on the slave.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the contradictions of slavery. But read Cato and the agriculturalists will tell you if, for instance, it's the low season, there is not much. Suppose also there is a crisis, you underfeed the slaves, you reduce the allowance of food, and the slave will just give him enough to survive to the maximum. So you adjust the cost also of food to the productivity of the slave. It's horrible, but it's exactly what happens. It's exactly what happened also in the South, the American South. So that's something that's very, very common between the two systems. Yes, to mitigate, you have to sell. I understand that the argument for no matter of cost. First, there are winners and there are losers. When you take a risk, you buy slaves. You hope that you will find a new vein in the Lorient, but you don't. And you lose your risk. Your neighbor will, you can make a lot of money if you won't. So there are winners and losers. And besides, for the case of the price of slaves, you may sell them also abroad. That's the whole story. So you may export them, and so maybe find a market where the prices will be higher than in your own market, which is depressed. So that's where it's cool to be.
Three questions. One is that happens for, let's say, big losers. People who lose their full estates, all their slaves are sold, this kind of thing, whether they're fools or gluttons. What about unprofitability at the lowest end? Not where you're reducing the food.
Yeah, I think that, again, it's in font, sorry, for all. Well, if it doesn't work in one sector, or you switch another one. For instance, the price of wheat is not high for a lot of reasons, so you transfer to for instance, capital to Emporia to trade on sea, or you transfer it to mining, or you transfer it to workshop, etc. So they were very mobile. So they didn't hesitate to switch. And when we read Xenophon's writing, we imagine a guy who is actually, for instance, a peasant who transforms himself into craftsman. It's not the case. It's for investors. They invested their money. And so they could invest their money from one sector to another. So it's a highly, the role of finance investment is much more important than that's suspected so far.
Yes, I was thinking about your example there with the mining industry in Brazil in the 80s. So is there always a stark difference between bounded and unbounded labor in cases where there's no economic freedom? I mean, maybe then it's really like if there's the supply and surplus of labor, which determines if property rights will develop. And you'd see that, I mean, miners in Brazil, for example, they volunteer to work under these conditions because they have no other outside economic option. So it's a certain type of slavery in a sense anyway, but without the physical constraint.
Yeah, you're referring to the level of supply of workforce, actually.
Yeah, so maybe that might be what sort of determines.
This is exactly one of my questions. This is why I spent so much time on the first part of demography and the question of demographic model. Because in some way, if they had not killed so many of their own children maybe they would have more workforce. But this was not the problem. A citizen must be a lawyer or maybe a man activity, but it's not good to go to become a worker, a miner, etc. Maybe you may do that, but it's not possible. So the whole trick is precisely that to avoid this, reserve the demographic model is central to make sense also of slavery. And the big question is, slaves were cheap because there were so many wars, hand-hands all over the Mediterranean. Hundreds of thousands of slaves over the years were available, so that impacted also the cost of slave work was relatively cheap. Slaves were cheap. Well, you had to invest maybe 200 drachms to buy a slave in Athens, but given the service that we provide, yes, it was cheap. We're doing it. Again, I'm not defending slavery, just explaining the system. Be very careful of the attack against slavery. Against Hogan by Comparative.
I mean, I'm wondering if the use of slavery in the face of demographic explosion may also be a liquidity problem. I mean, the Brazilian miner can volunteer to pull gold out of the ground, because he can sell the gold ingot for something useful. But would a silver ingot have been of any use to anyone who had nothing but this one silver ingot? Could he have monetized it? Whereas if there wasn't, if is a large labor pool useless if there is no liquidity, or if people are ignorant of the amount of liquidity there is that the reason that slavery is used?
No, I don't think so. In the case of if you have an ingot of silver, believe me, you are rich immediately. You can pay. You can buy something with that, even in this raw form, or you simply go to the next mint, and it will be transformed into coins. And you get the coins. You pay a few drachms for that, and you get the equivalent in coins. So it's not a problem. The problem is that you cannot. You don't find. You may find a big nugget of gold. You never find that in terms of silver. It's a process. It's an industrial process. Processing hundreds of thousands of tons of earth or ore to get finally, after many operations, to get the silver. It's a product of an industry. It's not about the issue of liquidity of the silver. I think maybe one last question. Yes.
The question I have a question, sort of general question. So the question is two-part. How do you read Aristotle's defense of natural slavery? The way I read it, I just wonder whether you agree with me, is that his defense of natural slavery actually reflects a lot of discomfort about the institution of slavery, in the sense that although he's defending the natural slaves, he's saying there's a whole realm of slavery that isn't justified, namely unnatural slaves. So part of that question is, do you think that's just a misreading of the politics, or do you agree with it? And if you agree with it, the second part of the question is, when you think, what's the nature of the discomfort? Where is that coming from, or how comfortable or uncomfortable? I mean, if it is a very well-established institution, what's the source of the discomfort?
Well, maybe I should start from the second point to the first one. Yes, the sources of discomfort that, as we said, there was a debate. There had always been a debate probably about slavery. This was not something new, and it was debated even in the stage in Athens, in the plays of the 5th century. If you read the plays of Euripides, you see the anguish of the Athenians at the end of the Peloponnesian War, because there are free people, there are imperial people, but they might become slaves if they lose the war. So this the question of legitimacy of beyond the physical approach, it was something that was strongly felt by any free person in the Greek world, because he knew that his fate might be that of becoming the slave. This is kind of anguish. It's not reasoning, it's anguish, and it justifies anguish. The question is, so maybe I will give you one answer which wouldn't be my final answer to the question, but as we know, we have in Aristotle always the distinction between what is kataphysin or katanomon. It's a really fundamental distinction. And he has this two. And obviously, well, he mentions the fact that some don't approve that, and however, he uses, again, this distinction, kataphysin, katanomon, and what he tries to show is this kind of non-distinction finally, that it is justified physique by nature, but in the end it is justified by the law. So his effort, I'm not sure it's very successful. If you read every sentence, some of the sentences are very bizarre. The very beginning of the politics are very bizarre in justification. What he tries to do, he tries to mix the natural approach and the nomos approach. Whether he succeeds is another story, but he thinks he has succeeded.
I mean, I thought he wanted the law to be grounded in that it fits nature. You know, that if it's a good law, it will justify slavery for those who deserve it. But yeah, I mean, I'm just puzzled by where. I mean, it seems to me that the answer to the question that you're giving is that the discomfort around slavery is based in the fear that it might happen to me or my loved ones, that I might get captured, but not in any, you might say, some kind of instinctive sympathy for the institution per se, or for my fellow humans.
I think it's part of the deal. It's part of this. This discomfort was based on the fear and anguish. It's not necessarily rational, very rational approach, but it was there. It was self-obvious. So I think that even Aristotle's justification of slavery must have that in mind, just like every free person in Greece.